Cheers, guys. Epix 911. Welcome to the Thursday, January 26th, 2017 edition of VR News. I want to start briefly, quickly, talk about the i7 that I purchased yesterday. I had a few questions from you guys on that. It's VR related in a sense, so let's cover that quickly. Gaming wise, which is what most people want to know, there were definitely improvements. Sometimes you get hung up on that frame rate counter, whether it's fraps or built in, and people have a bad habit of letting that be the overriding factor. And I admit I fall into that trap all the time. But your minimum frame rate, average, max, those are a little harder to gauge. Visually, they manifest in it just looking smoother, and absolutely games were smoother. The handful that I tried last night, Arizona Sunshine, like a new game. The head explosions that I thought looked good on an i5 were built with an i7 in mind, and man does it show. It is like night and day. I'll see if I can do a comparison and just let you see the difference. It's absolutely astounding, the difference. So gaming wise, absolutely. But again, that frame rate counter might not look that different from game to game, but it's more fluid and better. And in some cases, the frame rate was better. The more eye candy you turn on, the better your GPU. With a 1080 and above, the Titan X's, for example, you're going to get benefit. SLI, you would get benefit, although that currently doesn't really benefit you too much with virtual reality. That may change in the future. So those were all good reasons, and those are gaming reasons, but they weren't ultimately enough. What I should have been thinking about, but didn't, but that's where Jefferson's video came in. I was joking around about a lot yesterday at the start of the video, but what I didn't joke about was that video that he linked. It was the catalyst for me doing additional research, and the one that ultimately won me over was video rendering time. You guys might not know, I think I've maybe said it before, but a news video typically takes 3 to 6, 7 plus hours, depending on how many takes and the complexity of the editing, etc., rendering times, all of that factored in. My rendering time alone improved by about 50 to 75%. I shaved 30 minutes off yesterday's news rendering, another 30 with Resident Evil. That's about an hour I saved. Push that out through a week, and that's a full workday, a full roughly 8-hour workday saved just by going to an i7. Hyper-threading is huge for photos and video editing, and even though you know that, you kind of tend to forget that because we buy these mostly gaming focus. That's the overriding focus. So yeah, the rendering time, awesome improvement. Again, the fluidity. My 4K videos chug on Adobe Premiere with an i5, depending on the codecs and what I'm putting in, smooth on the i7, no issue. So if the only benefit I had got out of this was the video editing and the photo efficiency improvements with the bigger cache and that hyper-threading, that would have been reason enough. The VR, the gaming, all of that is just gravy as far as I'm concerned. So there you have it. Now let's talk video games for VR, and start with Ace Combat 7 Skies Unknown. This is for PlayStation VR. It includes a handful of virtual reality enabled missions. So make no mistake, the company probably did this later, or I was going to say late or later in that game's development cycle, but make no mistake, they are going to be watching. They've got multiple ways of doing that, and see how often it gets played. And if it's popular, they probably will do something akin to Resident Evil 7 with their next game and have a full VR mode. I'm pretty confident of that. This is kind of their way of gauging. So if you like jet combat games, this one is more arcade than it is simulator, but it's known for the better looking realistic graphics that the arcade fighter games tend to not have, but the simulation-based ones do. So it kind of makes this one kind of the best of both, really, if that's your bag. So if it is, definitely support that. Probably lead to better things down the road. Next game, Mervils, a VR adventure. This is a game that's currently on Steam for Rift and Vive for $19.99 US. Coming to the PlayStation VR, specifically February the 21st of this year. So basically just 3.5 weeks, and another virtual reality game. So things are starting to move along for VR, at least on the Sony front, which is terrific as far as I'm concerned. And they also plan on keeping that price. A lot of times that price goes up once it hits PlayStation. This time they want to keep it at $19.99 US for the foreseeable future. Now this next game, Bait, for Gear VR, has passed 1 million downloads, which if you consider there's 5 million units out there for the Gear VR, that's 1 in 5. That's pretty damn good. But, and not to crash the party, that doesn't necessarily mean it's 1 million unique downloads. It could be, because this is Gear VR, remember, it could be people who've upgraded phones and, didn't do cloud backup or any of that. They've got to reinstall it. It could be just installs in general on another phone wiping causing to download. That's probably factoring in there as well. Either way, 1 million, 1 in 5 is pretty damn good. So grats to the devs for Bait. Not my game, but for those who enjoy it, it's obviously fairly successful. First news story involves Sony's VR confusion made all the more confusing and strange with these lineups in Japan. Check this out on the picture here. This is from a Twitter user in Japan. He caught this and sent it out. It's a lineup for PlayStation VR HMDs, which apparently are very difficult to get in Japan. I've heard from a few of you in other parts of the world that's also the case. So when I say confusing, and even though there's business reasons, the closing down of the studio and then not following up with a "don't be nervous, guys" blog or video or tweet from Sony, that creates the doubt and confusion in a lot of people, because I've had a lot of you tell me that you're worried about Sony. I personally don't think there's anything to worry about. I think they're pretty much not 100% all in with VR. They could pull a Vita after, another year or so, but at this point, I think they're very, very, very vested still. So wouldn't worry too much, but case in proof that these are hard to get. So their production lines have by no means ground to a halt. Next news story, and this one also caught some sensations last night. Microsoft removed wording from the Project Scorpio webpage to do with virtual reality. And essentially they had a little blurb in there that said high fidelity VR in a list of bullet points. They removed that bullet point. Users of NeoGAF noticed that and started talking about it. A couple of companies followed up with Sony, GameSpot being one of those, and was told that when Project Scorpio ships later this year, it will offer high fidelity VR. They didn't elaborate on that, but that still is their plan. Why they then removed it, again, it's one of those confusing things, kind of like we just talked about with Sony. You wonder, but apparently not the case. They're not dropping it, which wouldn't make sense given what they're planning this year for VR. Good to know that that isn't in fact anything to worry about. Next news story, Mark Zuckerberg today announced Hugo Barra. This was actually yesterday. I say today with my crazy hour keeping. This came late last night, but Hugo Barra, he's from Chinese site Xiaomi company rather. He has been appointed the basically vice president of VR for both Facebook and Oculus. And remember, Brendan Arib, he has stepped kind of into a different role to head PC VR specifically, and those initiatives. Look, at the end of the day, was it a demotion? From where I'm sitting, yes. Others could argue it was lateral, but no. It was certainly lateral in one sense, but to me, it did seem like a bit of a demotion. Now, it does allow him, true to his words, to be more invested, and he hasn't left, so he must still be happy. So possibly not, now that I think about it more. But again, we'll chalk that up to suspicious and strange and one to watch. But that's Hugo Barra, so he comes with quite a bit of experience. And most importantly, he's worked with Zuckerberg before, which kind of can help. Unless you're on the opposite side of a lawsuit, then it doesn't help. But Brendan Arib himself tweeted that joining Facebook as VP of Virtual Reality to lead Team Oculus, so excited. So he's on board. Hopefully that was all from him and he wasn't pressured. But yeah, remains to be seen how effective this new role is going to be. Hopefully, guys, we see Oculus back on track with some of those things they were known for or expected to do in the first place. Like when we talk about openness, whether that's code, games, how they can be played. If they go a little bit more into HTC's direction in that respect, I think that will be a good thing. All right, next news story. Lots of musical chairs in VR last couple of days. HTC's top Vive designer leaving to work for Google Daydream. So leaving PC virtual reality to go join mobile VR, albeit under Google's umbrella, which is a deep-pocketed umbrella. But still, like I said, just an interesting case of kind of musical chairs going on in VR. The individual involved, Claude Zellweger, he was HTC's VP of Design. No word yet on what the new title is going to be, but I'm sure we're going to find out in a couple of days. All right, and this next and last story. This is an interview with Alvin Graylin. He's the Vive president. He says that the next-gen VR headsets are likely to come in 1 to 3 year cycles. And he said it's going to sit somewhere in between console cycle, which we know is typically 5 to 7 years roughly, depending on who we're talking about. There's times where Sega's been a little bit, well, no, they fell in even with the last one, but typically 5 to 7 is that cycle. Phones, that can be every year. So hopefully 2 to 4, even 2.5 to 3.5, 4, that would be more realistic in my opinion. But that's not to say, according to him, that they wouldn't be doing other things. And his exact blurb on that was, instead of looking at just the phone market, which is one type of very rapid consumer product, if you look at the other segments, which is stuff like consoles, they are about 5 or 6 year type cycles. What I would imagine is that the VR headsets are probably somewhere in between, probably tending closer towards the phone cycles than console, but definitely not as quick as the early smartphone era with the major updates. So that's going to put the hardware refresh cycle for the VR headsets, by Graylin's estimate, somewhere between 1 and 3 years, like I said from the outset. And he did qualify, though, and say there are improvements to be made to the experience even within a generation through accessories. And that's what we're seeing with the new cabling, the trackers, and wireless. All of those initiatives are being done within this current generation. So I like what he said. He ended it with, but what we do between cycles, accessories, the thing that you're seeing is that we've created a good foundation platform to build things on. Changing it too quickly will actually make it very difficult for developers, make it difficult for accessory makers and other types of systems that rely on it. And that is bang on. That first point, probably the most important. Nothing more frustrating for developers than a life cycle that they can't somewhat plan around. Believe me, that's huge. All right, guys, that is it for the news today. Not sure what game I'm going to be putting up next, but for sure, I'm going to be playing some Resident Evil 7. Cheers as always, guys.